in the Red Room. I remember being here one time before, but that didn't mean that I could find my way without help tonight. It was down this way and this way and this way, and eventually Mary Claire found me. So thank you, Mary Claire, for your invitation. And thank you for coming tonight. I think I heard that I have some college students here from maybe UPUC. Yes? Okay. And so if you take notes, I'll be really impressed. And there's some Sunday school classes here, and there's people from various aspects of this Columbus community. And it is always a joy to come down to Columbus. It's a nice progressive community. I always find that, I don't know, something in the water. You people are smart, you're bright, you're engaging, you're interested in things, and so it's a delight to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I think there's one certainty I'll start with, and that is I believe that all of us would prefer not to be here with this topic, if that were possible. I also have a couple predictions, and I hope I'm wrong, but I probably won't be. It's very likely that there will be something happening on American soil that whoever does it will claim to have some connection with ISIS or ISIL. The second prediction is one that unfortunately has already come true from someone who shared with me after one of my talks. I made the prediction that someone in this room is going to know someone who knows someone who will try to join this group. Whether they succeed or not, they will. The third prediction is a no-brainer, and that is that ISIS-ISIL will be a major issue in the upcoming presidential campaign. It's too serious, too important a topic. The policy as we have now, as we'll be talking about a little bit later, it begs for more thought and commitment of some sort. And finally, I'll make a promise that within about an hour, I will not take away your fear, but I will take away as best I can your confusion about ISIS-ISIL. Let me start by saying why it has so many names. ISIS-ISIL, I will use kind of interchangeably. ISIS is the term preferred by Republicans, and ISIL is the term preferred by Democrats. So I enjoy CNN interviews with somebody from the White House because the interviewer says ISIS and the person from the White House says ISIL, and they're staring at each other like who's going to back down, and neither of them do. It can also be called the Islamic State, and sometimes the media here will say the so-called Islamic State because we don't recognize them. The Arabic name for the group is Daesh, which is perhaps still not their own preference. I think they would see themselves, as reasons we'll talk about a little bit later, as the Islamic State. So I'm going to start with something very unpopular for Americans, and that's the ancient history. We are not crazy about ancient history, but I just wanted to start with a couple slides to show the extent of the Islamic Empire at times in the past when some of the radical groups we're talking about would say, that time in the past was when history was in the right direction, when God was in charge, and we had a grand, glorious history, a glorious time. So we have the Mediterranean region here, and we have them all the way up into Spain, close to Turkey as well at this point. This is all within, I think, 100 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. So this is, Islam was the fastest growing geographically of any religion in the history of the world. In the Ottoman Empire, this is present-day Turkey, and that was where the Ottoman Empire was centered.
What's important for our purposes, this down here, the plight of Arabs, is that in Persia we have Persians, in Turkey we have, or Anatolia, we have Turks, and this area down here was the Arab communities, tribes, and so when I say the plight of Arabs, what I mean by that is that the Arabs were second-class citizens in the Turkish Ottoman Empire, and that will become a factor, I think, in the next couple slides. Something that a lot of people are confused about, I would not even bother to describe these two groups, except we're not going to make much sense of ISIS-ISIL unless we understand that what these two groups are about. The Sunnis are 85% of the Muslims in the world. Al-Qaeda and ISIS-ISIL are Sunni radical groups. That's one thing to remember. The other thing to remember is that 99.9% of Sunnis in the world reject Al-Qaeda and ISIS-ISIL. And that's very important for us to understand because, as we'll talk a little bit later, ISIS-ISIL exploits the lack of understanding about Islam in this country to make it difficult for Muslims in our communities to enjoy their lives here. So Sunnis make up about 85% of all the Muslims in the world, and the way this group was identified as different from the Shia was that the Sunnis believed that when the Prophet Muhammad, before he died, his wish was to have the community itself, called the Ummah, choose the next leader, the Caliph. The last Caliph that was in the Sunni world was 1922 at the end of the Ottoman Empire. What's interesting is June of 2014, so not that long ago, in a story that we didn't probably pay a lot of attention to, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIL, or ISIS, declared himself to be the Caliph. And again, this may not have been noticed by too many Americans, but it was noticed by Boko Haram in Africa. It was approved and noticed by the Taliban in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and by various groups in North Africa. So there's these satellite radical groups that have signed on to the idea that the caliphate is being reconstructed under the leadership of al-Baghdadi. The Shia, less than 15% of Muslims in the world, have a different understanding. They believe that the Prophet Muhammad, before he died, wanted the leader of the community to be one of his descendants. Sunnis and Shia agree on the first 4 caliphs after the Prophet, but after that, they dispute that the caliphs in the Sunni community have any validity because they were not related to the Prophet necessarily. This is the primary cause of the oppression of Shia in the world under Sunni control. Only in certain countries of the world have the Shia been able to control their own fortune, and that's happened in a dramatic way, increased in the last 10 years. And so that in this country that we all have been thinking about for a long time called Iraq. (1913) and 1917 is a very important date if we want to understand the rage of this group. A lot of people say, I don't understand why they're so angry. What's this beheading about, and why are they so enraged? And really the roots of this go back principally to 100 years ago during the First World War. The Ottoman Empire here, already reduced in size because of Europe's resurgence, the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany in World War I. And if you've seen the film Lawrence of Arabia, you might remember that story, that the British and the French saw the opportunity to work with Arab tribes here to revolt against the Ottoman Empire making it more difficult for the Ottoman Empire to support the German cause. There was an Arab revolt during World War I, and the sad thing to share is that the Arabs were promised at the end of, if the Allies won, at the end of the war, there would be an Arab state. And Europe broke the promise. The promise was that there would be an Arab state that would include the Arabian Peninsula and the Fertile Crescent, but there was a secret agreement between the French and the British, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which the area that we're going to be talking about was divided up by Europe. To the credit of President Woodrow Wilson, he thought that this was a shame that the Arabs were betrayed by the British and the French. So instead of an Arab state after World War I, look what happened to the map. This is basically the map that we have today. We have Iran, we have Iraq as a separate nation, we have Syria, we have a little nation called Kuwait in there, we have Lebanon, we have Jordan. These boundaries were all created by Europe after World War I. The French colonized Syria and Lebanon, and the British colonized Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq, and Kuwait. Going along with colonialism was this is the term used by Edward Said, who was a prominent Islamic scholar, even though he is a Christian Arab. And he defines Orientalism during this period as the assumption by colonizing Europeans that Islamic society, culture, and religion were exotic but inferior and backward to European values, to Christianity. How many of you are watching the program called Indian Summers on PBS? Okay. Well, you can sense that colonizing sense of superiority that the British had in India, and it was similar in this part of the world after World War I. And this was experienced, and it's a very important term for what we're going to be talking about, as a form of cultural humiliation. That they were promised a state, were not given a state, and then the French and the British, when they were there, treated them as inferior persons, an inferior culture. Islam particularly is inferior to Christianity. Some of us might remember 1958 to 1962 in a reaction, in a sense, after Israel becomes a state in 1948, there is a feeling that, between Egypt on the left and Syria on the right, that if they could combine forces in some way, they might do better if, with what they anticipated, which became true, upcoming wars with Israel. And so from 1958 to 62, Egypt and Syria were known as the United Arab Republic. The two words that I want us to keep in mind are United Arab. This is what they were promised. Here we go, 40 years later. Here's an attempt to start to bring it together. It didn't last because the president of Egypt, Nasser, was too dominant and the Syrians walked away from the deal. But the fact that they were trying to pull an Islamic state together at this time, it wasn't violent at this point, is important. Helps us understand what's going on. More of us remember all the trauma around the Iranian Revolution, and this is where the American experience in the region it becomes a factor. So 1953, about that time, there was an election in Iran, and a democratic election, and the Shah was removed. He went to Rome and was going to be in exile. The CIA, for the first time, and it was just pretty much a new organization, perpetrated something we would now call a, not so much regime change, but they went to the Shah in Rome and convinced him to return home. They put the Shah back in power. The United States was concerned that Russia would move in if Iran was a democracy and exploit the oil. And so we funded the Shah and his very aggressive secret police force called SAVAK. Then we had this turmoil in which the Ayatollah Khomeini, who had been exiled in Paris, we might remember there's just millions of people protesting in the streets. The Shah is removed. I believe he dies in Florida, as I remember. And the Ayatollah Khomeini returns. And it's part of a dance that Iran has with the United States between humiliation and this word that Jessica Stern in her book, Terror in the Name of God, has termed dehumiliation. And that is, Iran felt humiliated by the United States intervention, putting aside the democratic election, reinstating the Shah. The Ayatollah Khomeini's return had a lot of power, what we call dehumiliation, taking away the humiliation. Shortly thereafter, as we know, they surrounded and then broke into the U.S. Embassy and kept, as if you remember like I do, every night on the news, there was another number, another day that our hostages were being kept by the Iranian people. That felt wonderful to the Iranians because they were striking back at the country that had tried to control them. What happened shortly thereafter was the Iraq-Iran war. We supported Iraq, Saddam Hussein, and we looked the other way when Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons against the Iranian people. So we have an issue in the country right now about whether to trust the Iranians with the nuclear arms or nuclear potential of Iran. We need to remember that the Iranians have a bigger problem trusting us, given what we have done in that region. This map is color-coded. The red is a little deceptive, and I'll explain that in a minute. The red is the areas where the Shia are in the majority. Well, Iran is totally Shia. Persians are Shia, almost totally Shia. Iraq, next door to it, is also red, but that's only due to population, and that is during the time of Saddam Hussein, the majority of people in Iraq are Shia, but Saddam Hussein was Sunni. And so the Ba'athist party that ran Iraq under Saddam's leadership was a minority government ruling a majority people. It was, it's like 40-60. It wasn't like the Sunnis were a small number of people, but it was a significant minority. But anyway, Iraq was technically a majority of Shia. We'll see that Syria here is in yellow, which means that it's primarily Sunni, but it's the reverse, because Assad is an Alawite, and that's a group that affiliates with the Shia. So this is like a confusing chess game, right? So here we got Shia, here we got majority of Shia ruled by a Sunni, here we got majority of Sunni ruled by a Shia, and then Lebanon over here is turning pink due to the presence of Hezbollah. We'll talk about that in the next slide. And you'll see Yemen, which is in the news a lot down here, is also a mix. And even there's a little country of Bahrain, which is a majority of Shia. But primarily in the history of this region, the only area where the Shia have been in control for long periods of time was in Iran. The rest has been under Sunni domination. Even before Assad, the leader in Syria was Sunni. In the early 1980s, the war in Lebanon during the Reagan administration, Early in the 20th century, the Christian population was actually the majority in Lebanon, but by 1980, it had decreased from 29% to 16%. And in an interview I did with one of the monks up at St. John's Monastery in Minnesota, they have a project going. They try to go to war-torn areas. We obviously, when a war happens, we obviously and rightly think of the human casualties. St. John's Monastery thinks of the casualties to ancient manuscripts. They also get destroyed in war. So St. John's has a program of going and no longer photographing, but digitizing the ancient manuscripts of the world, so that if war breaks out in this country. And so anyway, the monk I was interviewing had been in Lebanon, and he shared the story with me that Christian friends of his there said, I have to leave, my children have no future here. We're shrinking in our size. Back even in the 80s, there was a Muslim president, I think, or a prime minister, and the other was a Christian leader, so it was divided. Hezbollah has moved into the region with the decrease of Christian population. Hezbollah is Shia and is supported by Iran, and they have been then north of Israel on the map and have had various small wars with Israel in Lebanon and also in northern Israel. So I found a textbook that doesn't seem that old to me, 1989. And Thomas Ludwig is a respectable scholar, and he wrote this: the price of this post-World War I nationalism has been, what Europe did to the Middle East, has been the breakup of the worldwide unity of Islam. And then he goes on to say, and in the modern world, it has not been possible for Islam to transcend the political barriers of the nation state. In other words, Ludwig is saying those boundaries are going to be there. Well, this is exactly what ISIL is refuting. When their troops crossed over from Syria into Iraq, one of the things they did is that they stopped and they brought in bulldozers and they bulldozed the border between the two countries. It's very symbolic, because what they're saying is Syria and Iraq are inventions of Europe. We destroy this border, and it is now the Islamic State. So they literally don't see themselves moving between Syria and Iraq. They're moving within this thing called the Islamic State, which they believe will expand. Just shows how much has happened in recent years. We have a whole region of people who are feeling humiliated and then are trying to do something to put history right. So 1948, Zionists succeed in creating, with UN approval, a nation state in the state of Israel, feeling they were taking back their biblical inheritance or lands from the biblical times. Of course, the Palestinians living in the region and the Arab nations surrounding Israel went to war with them because they felt that Israel was a European-American colony that had been superimposed on the region. 1990, Saddam Hussein sought to take back Kuwait. And this is a very interesting story that we have the record now that Saddam actually communicated with the US ambassador for Iraq and sort of floated the idea of what, well, the United States too, because in his mind, Kuwait again was an invention of the British. And yes, there had been tribes in Kuwait area, but he felt it was not only a natural part of Iraq, but also an important seaport for oil distribution. And so he invaded Kuwait thinking the United States would not oppose him. He was rudely surprised when President George Bush I, you might remember, came on television and gave that famous line, "This aggression will not stand." And that became the beginning of Desert Storm, in which then the coalition forces with the US are trying to take back. Again, this verb, this sense of people, we're taking back what's ours, we're taking back what's ours. 2001 in Afghanistan, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda had fought the Soviets and had probably more to do with hospitality, Arab hospitality, or hospitality within the Islamic tradition, had allowed Al-Qaeda to hide out in Afghanistan. We then invaded Afghanistan, and Taliban have been fighting ever since to take back from the U.S. presence there. 2003 and following, the war in Iraq by George Bush II, that immediately created all kinds of what we call sectarian warfare between the Sunnis and the Shia. Remember Saddam, it was Sunni, and the Shia were the majority. And this was the bloody years of Iraq. And this is when a lot of Americans lost their lives, soldiers there who were in the crossfire as the Sunnis and the Shia were attacking one another. We'll explain a little bit later, ISIL now is seeking to take back Syria, Iraq, and more from what has happened on the map. It's important to note that Al-Qaeda and ISIL are related, but they're not the same. It was kind of frustrating for ISIL. They've been around with their own separate identity since 2006, but the United States always saw them as a branch of Al-Qaeda, and we just lumped them together. We didn't realize that they had some different agendas. Just go to the bottom. Al-Qaeda is seeking to undermine the Shia-dominated government. Okay, so what we're talking about here is that the American forces eventually in Iraq, as you will remember, were able to make an election possible. You might remember the photos of people with ink on their thumbs, that they were not afraid to vote. Well, we knew, the United States knew who was going to win the election. It was going to be the Shia. They were in the majority. That was a given. But the American dream, which I don't fault, and I resist sometimes my students who want to blame everything on oil, the American dream was that, yes, the Shia would win, but if they would have a power-sharing government with the Sunnis, that would be a beachhead in the region of a Western-style democracy that might then influence what Afghanistan, Pakistan, other countries in the region would do. So the United States had what I called a legitimate grand dream. The unfortunate outcome was that once the Shia came into power and we put pressure on them to include the Sunnis, they said, no way. We've been oppressed by them for centuries. We're not sharing power with them. The Sunnis are primarily up, maybe I should go back to that map. The Sunnis in Iraq are primarily up in this region, near the Syrian border, the north and the west. The Shia are down here. Once the Shia won control, healthcare for Sunnis went down, education for Sunnis went down, and paychecks for Sunnis went down. We then had these terrible stories that were so difficult to understand when 400 ISIL fighters would cross what we would call the border. 400 would take the weapons of 10,000 Iraqi soldiers. And go, how can that be? Well, the reality is that the soldiers up in this region are Sunni, and they detested the government in Baghdad. It was Shia and was oppressing them for the first time in their history. And so when ISIL crossed the border, they saw them as fellow Sunnis. And so they gave up our weapons. We had equipped the Iraqi army, but they then were the beneficiaries of our weapons because they gave them over to ISIL. And that's where ISIL has been mainly operating, is in the northern half of Iraq. The civil war in Syria, which has led to a confusion in U.S. foreign policy. Up in 2 years ago, the language coming out of the White House is Assad has to be removed. He uses chemical weapons against his people. He has to go. He has to go. And then we began to hear reports from Yazidis and from Christians in the region who were saying, if he goes, there's some groups around that are going to be worse than him. And that was a reference to ISIS-ISIL. At that point, you might remember the Obama administration sort of what became paralyzed. And I'm speaking